thank you for coming today. I think we'll get started. It's really my pleasure today to introduce David Rogers to you. David and I have actually known each other for about the last 10 years and have sort of interacted and collaborated in various ways on various projects at the sort of the edge between the science and the art of earthquakes. The academic story on David is, since that's sort of our formal thing around here, is he's currently working on a Master of Fine Arts in research, which means he actually does things in art as opposed to just going to class at the College of Fine Arts, University of New South Wales in Australia. But I think that really expresses very little about David. The unusual things about David are, first, that he owns a shake table. I think there are very few people in the world who can claim that they own a large shake table. There's a good story behind how he came to be one of them. And I think there are probably even fewer. Maybe he may be the only person who owns one who is actually an artist, as opposed to just going around letting people ride on their shake table. He does very interesting things with it. And that's what he's going to talk about today. I think another thing that sets David apart is in his ability to get these things done is a work process that I really admire. And you'll see this was a huge undertaking that he'll talk about today, his installation at Parkfield. And the way it came about is that at any moment when the next step was possible, he did it. Without regard to whether or not the following step was even vaguely possible, likely, or the steps after that. And there were many, many steps. And the result was that at each point when something happened that made the next step possible, he was ready to do it. And then sooner or later, the next step, something would work out. And eventually, it all came together. And I'm really glad he did that, because my experience with this project was once he got it in the ground with the small amounts of help I gave him and large amounts of help he got also from other people, and I went down and experienced this installation, was that it really made some of the things we know about earthquakes, their sort of stochastic random nature, but with heavy dose of clustering on top of that, much more real to me. I mean, than the figures that grace many of my papers. It really made some of the realities about earthquakes in California much more visceral. And I think that sort of experience can speak to a lot of people, maybe better than many of our usual scientific lectures about them that we use as outreach. And so I think this sort of work is really very valuable, and I'm glad David undertakes it and shows such perseverance, and today is going to share with us what he did. David.
Well, thanks, Andy. And good afternoon, everyone. And I'll just firstly use this opportunity to thank the USGS for supporting this work, and particularly Andy Michael and Scott Heifner, Andy Snyder and Parkfield. Without their support, it wouldn't have been possible. And I also must thank the College of Fine Arts, University of New South Wales, for making this trip to the US possible. Well, it was a big undertaking, but today this presentation is spread into 4 components. I'm going to talk about a history of land art and earth art, which will give this project some context. I'm also going to talk about the history of seismic art, which is an emerging field which is not very old, but yet it also goes back a very long time. And I'm also going to talk about the project in Parkfield itself, and also future directions with where this work may go. Some of you may or may not be familiar with land art or earthworks. That's really started in the West Coast USA in the late 1960s. There was a spurt of these monumental works that took place in the landscape, permanent works which still exist today. It faded out, and in the contemporary age, it's not really been explored. I'm just going to show a few slides of what are the most important works. Will give you some idea. I won't expand on them greatly because they are very deep in context, but I'll just give you an overview, and you're welcome to follow up and look at these works themselves. Some of you may be familiar with them. Double Negative, 1970, Nevada, by Michael Heiser. This was an earth displacement, 1,500 yards long, and it involved 250,000 tonnes of earth being displaced. Interesting thing about this work, Michael Heiser was 24 years old when this work took place. Most famous land art earthwork example is probably the Spiral Jetty, 1970, Great Salt Lake, Utah, by Robert Smithson. This photograph was actually taken by Scott Heifner last year on the Great Salt Lake with his kite photography. City, 1970, Nevada, again by Michael Heiser. This work's incomplete. This work's still being built. It's a very unique and large-scale monumental work, 2.5 miles long, 750 yards wide, due for completion sometime 2010. Rodin Crater, 1972, Arizona, by James Turrell. This work is still being completed, due for completion shortly, using the dormant dome of a volcanic cone, building an architectural structure inside it, which you view the exterior surfaces of the atmosphere and the starscape. Star Axis, 1976, New Mexico, by Charles Ross. This work's incomplete. Status is unknown, very similar to the Rodin Crater project. Again, it's using and exploring our outer perspective of the starscape. Sun Tunnels, 1976, Utah, Nancy Holt. Lightning Field, 1977, New Mexico, by Walter D. Maria. An array of 20-foot high stainless steel rods which attracts lightning at certain times of the year. And lastly, we jump to now, which is the Long Now Foundation's 10,000-year clock project, which is in the process of being installed and cut into Mount Washington, Nevada. Interestingly, this project, and you should be all familiar, I would hope, at some point with the Long Now Foundation with their future directions of long-term thinking and sustainability. What is seismic art? Well, I would like to point out that probably seismic art probably happens in places like this. This is where the seismic art's happening. But there is a cultural context of seismology being interpreted in a visual way. And we can go back to this lithographic print, destruction of Pompeii, Vesuvius eruption, Italy in 79 AD, artist unknown. Beating the catfish, which caused the 1855 Tokyo earthquake, Japanese woodblock print, artists unknown. And here we jump up to the contemporary age. And here we have Andy Michael's Earthquake Quartet, which for me is probably the first example of a contemporary interpretation of the seismic landscape in a cultural context as a music piece. There are a couple of other examples of seismic music compositions that exist. I feel this is the purest one, and it's I'll expand on a little bit later, but this is where the actual connection between an Andy and I started. Maury, an internet-based earthwork by Ken Goldberg from UC Berkeley. This is the first example, and as he refers to as an internet-based earthwork, of using seismic data to create a visual display and interpretation. This installation actually is running real-time data as a visual display from a Berkeley Hayward Faults seismometer. Earthquake Rose. This wasn't an artwork per se, but I feel it is an artwork. It was actually a sand tracing pendulum in a gift shop in Olympia, Washington, which created this pattern as a result of magnitude 6.8 earthquake 2001. I don't know if it's whereabouts today. Size Monitor, 2002, Sydney, Australia. This is my first work with exhibiting the earthquake shake table in a cultural context inside an art gallery. The shake table for this installation was controlled and triggered by globally monitored seismic data, which was a very simple Perl scripts driving the table, US events 3 and above and global events 5 and above. This was the connection with Andy, and this is when the Earthquake Quartet, the score, was actually performed at the opening of this exhibition by Sydney musicians. Earth 2004, California, Steve Roden. I haven't seen this personally, but I stumbled upon this a couple of years ago, but it was, again, a music-based installation. This 24-foot long wooden chamber with solenoid motors and glockenspiel bars were controlled by an interpretation of the 1996 Landers earthquake, so it actually played a musical and continuous loop of what that earthquake actually sounded like. Christina Mcphee and her work Carrizo Prime 2006, which is a video installation. Christina also actually spent a lot of time in Parkfield last year documenting the process of installing the shake table. This particular video work was actually shot on the Carrizo Plain, the Wallace Creek, Soda Lake region. Interestingly, she's exploring what I feel is the seismic resonance that exists in the landscape and the people who actually reside in this seismic field. Ballymore, 2006, Ken Goldberg. This work's an expansion of his Morey internet earthwork. It was performed once as part of the 2600th anniversary of the San Francisco earthquake, performed by a ballet dancer from San Francisco Ballet Company. And then we're jumping right ahead to the Parkfield Interventional EQ Fieldwork, a seismic machine earthwork installed in central California in the remote township of Parkfield between 18th of August, 16th of November 2008. This work ran autonomously and continuously, triggered by Californian-only seismic activity. Part machine, part earthwork, part performance. And here we have a kite aerial photograph taken by Scott Heifner. This photograph was taken early November. And what we're looking at here is a shake table weighing almost 8,000 pounds, installed in a trench measuring 50 feet long by 30 feet wide by 6 feet deep. The intention with immersing it in the ground below ground level was very integral to the idea of actually wanting to intervene with the landscape. It was a temporal rupture, so hence the word interventional. Fieldwork, as in the sense I'm working in a field. The original concept was to see how I could drive this table as quickly as possible, triggered only by Californian seismic data. The conceptual premise was to bring all the seismic data to one hypothetical and conceptual epicenter. So every seismic event that occurred during this 91-day period was reflected through this table. The delay resulted in anywhere between 30 seconds to 2 minutes after seismic events occurred before the shake table would trip. What I'll do now is play some video. Video by Mark Lotter, who's actually here today. Thanks for shooting that, Mark. What we're looking at here is the shake table itself, and I'll just briefly explain. You saw me jumping. I was triggering a geophone sensor which was buried. And there were 3 degrees of control that controlled the shake table. The first point of control was actually the actual seismic events. Magnitude 0.1 and above would actuate the table. An algorithm would determine the output of the table, and magnitude determined duration. So obviously the small events made small operational times of the shake table. The pump that supplied the hydraulics to the machine was continuous. And what would happen is the sensors, north, south, east and west, you could actually actuate and jump on these sensors, propagating the vertical motion of the shake table, like throwing stone in a pond and watching these waves propagate away from you. And when there was no local activity where audience or visitors to the site could participate with the sensors and the machine itself, or there were not seismic events, the table would creep continuously 1 inch every 15 seconds. It would just creep left and right in the northwest direction, the same way the San Andreas Fault and the Pacific Plate is broken between the Pacific Plate and the North American Plate. So it was this idea that this landscape is never static. And those rods you saw attached to the table and oscillating, even when the table wasn't supplying full delivery, they were constantly resonating. I was very interested in the idea that the landscape is constantly alive. It is never static, it is never asleep. Then the machine itself would actually run from 6:30 a.m. in the morning till 9:30 at night. The machine would shut down, the control system would keep collecting seismic events and then would wake at dawn at 6:30 a.m. and replay any activity that occurred during the night, like a seismic rooster, waking, and then it would continue back into live mode. The shake table itself, 70 feet long, 11 feet wide, by almost 5 feet high, weighing 8,000 pounds. It can carry a 5,500 pound payload, which is 25 to 30 people. It's a modular unit which fits into a 20-foot shipping container. But the shake table has a history. It's what I call a ready-made. The machine existed. I didn't take this on from scratch. It's a long history. It actually came from a museum called the Earth Exchange, which was actually built in the early 90s as a result of the Newcastle 1989 earthquake just north of Sydney, Australia. And the shake table was actually built, installed permanently in this museum, suspended on the second floor. The museum actually shut in 1995. I just completed an undergraduate degree in media arts and photography. I'd heard about this, I had space at the time, and I actually tendered for it, and they let me take this machine out of the museum. I spent between 1999 and 2002 re-engineering the unit, so I actually made it modular. So as we just go back slightly, that whole subframe there is modular, it bolts into pieces, so hence I can actually fit it into a 20-foot container. So it was a process of engineering and application just to re-engineer this machine and make it useful, and then at the same time a Linux-based control system was developed to actually drive the table off seismic data, which led to me eventually visiting California in 2006 for the first time. And I actually came to the 1906 commemoration festivities that took place in San Francisco that week, which is now, that's three years ago already. That's when I met Andy. I came to Menlo Park, I talked to Andy. We'd been communicating on and off for years via email, and Andy really encouraged me to bring the shake table to the US, and he suggested Parkfield as possibly the place to try something out. Hence its significance with the Parkfield earthquake experiment. The fact that Parkfield is the most densely monitored open landscape of seismic instrumentation, monitoring seismic displacement. So conceptually, it felt very pertinent. I probably couldn't have installed this in a more poetic conceptual place which was crossing the boundaries of art and science, and it felt very important, and it was a wonderful suggestion that I went to Parkfield and its significance with its seismological importance, and the fact that it also triggered the next step of a residency which took place here at the USGS. I spent 2 months here late 2007 where I was given an office. I brought some hardware with me, and I spent a couple of months just starting to look at the data feed, how I could actually control the shake table. Now the machine itself installed in Parkfield, we can see the shake table in the distance, the control bunker to my left, which is all the hardware, was installed that drove the installation as well as sent out a video stream. And we have the hydraulic power pack and the step-up transformer which converted 50 hertz Australian power into 50 hertz into 60 hertz US. And looking at the schematic here, you can see the interior of the control bunker. It was a very confined space. One streaming box, one control box. And the system itself, I was using, I'm sure everyone here is familiar with Quake data distribution system, which a QDM merge catalog was created, and every event that went through there, the software would actually look for just Californian, NC and CI events only. As soon as we got a 0.1 event or above, away it would go. And we can also look at the same side, we look at the the input sensors from the geophones installed in the field was driving the same application. So we had those two components. It was locally triggered and also remotely triggered by actual seismic activity. Talking with Andy Snyder in Parkfield, we actually figured if there was a magnitude 3 earthquake within 5 miles of the installation, it probably would have triggered the installation locally. Interestingly, that eventually happened about 4 days after the installation was shut down. The development of software was a very interesting and unique collaboration. 90% of the work took place remotely while the machine was in the ground being prepared. And there were some very key and very important people who are very privileged to be involved with, obviously Andy, Michael here at the USGS, Dr. Gio Homsey, based in San Francisco and New York, Stock, based in Rotterdam, the Netherlands, and Mr. Snow, also from New Zealand, based in Sydney, Australia. Without these 4 people, the responsiveness of the machine itself to actual seismic activity just wouldn't have been possible. This was a wonderful collaboration, and it appears to be ongoing and exploring future directions, which I'll discuss shortly. So now I'm just going to go through basically a visual display of numerous photographic documentation or documents which were produced that from start to finish outlining and visualising as a document of what took place in Parkfield for almost 7 months. I literally embedded myself in town. The excavation, which was 7 hours, took 7 hours to displace almost 150 cubic yards of earth, which was very interesting. The first time I've actually worked with this kind of equipment to actually open up a landscape. And just a series of... This was actually streamed live on the net as a video stream. Again, photos by Christina Mcphee. So here we have, this was day 1. And I remember when the conditions were extreme. It was 110 degrees. This hole, once I dug the hole, it actually became another 10 degrees hotter in the hole. And I can remember actually, this is the afternoon of the 9th of June. Quite honestly, I can remember going, what have I done? But it was interesting. I actually spent the next day just going, oh, just slow down. And as Andy mentioned, there were all these different steps. It was rather audacious to actually take on a work this size. Originally, I'd intended to assemble the machine in the trench, but worked out very quickly that it was just crazy. I was going to fry. So I actually assembled the machine outside of the trench under shade. And as you can see here, nearly assembled. We can look at what I was actually putting a machine into the ground, which just, I look at these photographs now, and I was in Parkfield just recently, and I went, that was well, what I would say is kind of extreme activity to actually want to go ahead and work in this way. Fortunately, as we mentioned here, I had to get the machine in there. I used the excavator that did the excavation to lift it, and the owner of the excavator was quite happy for that to happen. The machine stayed on site, it wasn't working, which was very fortunate. I made spreader bars so we could actually lift the unit in one piece. So we just spent an afternoon walking the machine into position. So it's 29th of June. So this was when the machine finally went in the ground. Originally, when I started the project, I'd hoped to have the installation operational by the 28th of June. So the 29th of June, I actually got the machine in the ground. So I was already behind the 8 ball already. But it was fortunate, I wasn't working to a deadline. My deadline was self-imposed. So 91 days of continuous seismic connectivity. So on the 18th of August, the system finally went live. And we're looking at here is the postcard. This was the PyQF postcard, which some of you may have, but it was a bit of a play on the idea that everything stands to remain as a photograph in the contemporary age. And for me, this is the perfect example, though this was a postcard. Again, just a series of photographs. These are not kite photographs, these are actually just low-budget cameras stuck up on poles and thrown in the air. So you get some idea of the scale. Has anyone here visited Parkfield? I know a few have, but We should visit there one day and you might get some idea of what Parkfield was like in 2008. And these are some, just a sequence of kite aerial photographs, again taken by Scott Heifner, which is wonderful, wonderful documentation. What was interesting about the installation for me was, and having a machine, and literally living with a machine, the scale controlled by seismic activity, was an awareness that I felt about time itself. And what was interesting is this machine was so responsive, and the frequency, and there was a couple of instances of earthquake swarms, where there's one particular day where it was like 120 events went through that shake table in one period. And to me, it really emphasised that this idea that it was effectively reflecting and bringing to the surface all this seismic activity that exists and is very frequent that we don't see, feel or hear. And it made me realise that this potentially was a very good way to demonstrate the dynamic nature of this very active landscape. Again, photographs by Scott Heifner. There are also a series of high-resolution LiDAR scans taken by Gerald Borden, which are very interesting. The potential to actually use these LiDAR scans to create a virtual model that could be browser-based or installation-based and introduce the same connectivity to the video installation using these LiDAR scans and continue this particular work as a virtual document or an installation-based exhibition. The poster board. I felt I had to have a poster board. Like I walk up and down the corridors of the Menlo Park campus here, and the poster board was integral to explaining to visitors to the site what was actually taking place. And here we have a few examples of people reacting and responding to the installation. There's a couple of friends jumping with sensors. This is a school excursion. There were actually two school excursions that actually came out and saw the work. There was also a random geology field trip. They didn't know about it, but arrived and thought, well, this is wonderful. This wasn't planned for the day. So there was that, interestingly in Parkfield, it's a very remote, isolated place. But what I felt was very pertinent was the fact that people got it. People really understood what was going on there, particularly children. They reacted. I remember one day watching kids running from sensor to sensor and trying to do it as quickly as possible so the machine wouldn't stop. So they would actually keep the machine alive by running around the installation. And so the system ran continuously for those 91 days up until the 16th of November. And the last weekend, it was event-based, The Sounds of Seismic, which actually was two-part. It was almost a celebration. On the Saturday night, it was a series of seismic record, audio sonifications, and it actually turned into quite literally a dance party on the shake table to celebrate this almost momentous feat of actually pulling off a work of this nature, which was a lot of fun. It was the first time I've actually, since the machine originally came out of a museum, to actually allow people to stand back up on this device. And here we have a CCTV image of Andy Michael and his Earthquake Quartet performing on the shake table on the just after midday on Sunday the 16th, which was wonderful to actually, it was almost like a loop to go from that initial connection with Andy, which started around 2000, to actually have the quartet perform on the shake table in Parkfield on this particular day. Even Parkfield, it's interesting, the amount of numbers that actually came through Parkfield I was rather surprised. Once some publicity actually got out there by halfway through the installation, most weekends there would be, I figured, 100 to 150 people actually coming out to Parkfield to actually have a look at this. So it did draw some attention to what was actually taking place, which certainly made me emphasise, put this in an urban context. It could get rather interesting. And then the whole idea was no trace. So I spent I think it was 77 days to assemble and install and software test, 91 days to for the work itself to run autonomously and continuously, and 7 days to get out of there. Which this is the last CCTV still that was actually captured and streamed out of Parkfield, which I'll actually just show another little bit of video of what was going on there. There's no sound here. But what we're looking at here is over the 91 days, there are almost 43,000 frames streamed out of Parkfield. So we can see the time code going. And there's two reasons for doing this. One was documentation. I was also dealing with time and an interpretation and a mark of time. So effectively that 91 days was just a blip on the radar of geological time. But what was also very important about the stream, I was working in a remote location. This work was in a very remote place with access, was very difficult to get there. But it was very important that I have some form of accessibility to how this work could be viewed. So this stream was actually running, sending a frame out every 30 seconds. So every 3 minutes a JPEG frame was posted on the net and then refreshed. So you could constantly see that this machine was still there, the time code was changing, and it was continuous. And what we're looking at here now is actually 91 days compressed into 3 minutes 33. But the interesting thing about using the net was a big component of what I was doing. Obviously, I needed the internet to drive the installation, but I also needed the internet to disseminate what was taking place. And interestingly, to do this work in Parkfield, and over that 6-month period, the amount of the net and the way it's been picked up, there are hundreds of references to what actually took place during that time. So for me, it was a good example of how you can start from nothing and then disseminate remotely, and how we can get further reach into audiences by using these information technologies in the way the net's exploding now. And this was very important. Even while it was, the stats, the individual IP addresses that would actually go to the blog and look at the daily updates was consistently around 1,500 unique IP addresses a month, which is not much, but it's continued to grow. And now it's even still running at 2,000 individual IP addresses a month, which for something which is in the middle of nowhere, doesn't even exist anymore, it's continuing to resonate. And here we have 28th of November, the machine finally left Parkfield. And the machine stayed in California. It's in secure storage in Central California. I was very fortunate to have a trucking company offer their services to store the machine for me. And I saw it the other day, and it's wonderful. It can stay there as long as it's needed, and they're quite happy to take it on wherever where it could be shown in the future. And so I was just looking at a sequence of the site being closed up. It was very important that the work be no trace. Besides a few relics I actually left in the trench itself, which are buried in there, it was very pertinent to me that it was a no trace work. In many ways it represented the way over geological time landscape works, and essentially things evolve and they do disappear. So there's a layer of sedimentation below that site now. So this photograph by Andy Snyder is the 29th of December. And then we're looking at just a week ago, which is exactly a year ago since the installation was shut down. There really is no trace. Everything now about this particular work is net-based. It sits on the net. And that's an interesting field that I've always worked in with my art practice, is to actually, I've been very interested in the way about presence and absence, and how effectively everything stands to remain as a photograph. Like this presentation here is being archived. There's 50 people in this room, but over time this resonates further through the means of digital reproduction. So just a summary of what took place over those 91 days. So between 4,000 and 4,500 seismic events occurred, 43,000 web frames were disseminated, and then playing again with time, 91 days of intervention equates to almost 8 million seconds of time. So effectively it was a blip on the geological radar of time. And so now I just want to expand a little bit on future directions and where this may go, and some new work which I'm hopeful will appear in the near future. One in particular is Sounds of Seismic, an internet radio station streaming seismic audio from inner Earth. The principle behind Sounds of Seismic digitally processes real-time recorded seismic waveform data into audible sound files, then broadcasts these sonificated sound waves live across the internet 24/7, 365 days a year. This is a work I proposed to Fremont City in early 2008, but the idea is to install an array of steel and concrete pins somewhere on the Hayward Fault. Fremont Central Park would be perfect because it's a populated area and it's also in the centre of the Hayward Fault. The other possibility is to explore an idea of using something like Pinoli Point, but I just noticed just recently not a lot of activity has occurred on Pinoli, the northern end of the Hayward Fault around Pinoli Point for about 30 years. It would be wonderful to take this here, to implement a work like this. Again, it's the trick with this is dealing with and the process of bureaucracy and how you get these works in these public spaces and the system involved with actually installing these works and allowing these kinds of things to happen. The wonderful thing about Parkfield, I was working with a private landowner, and it was quite literally a case of, he literally said, sounds like I might sell a few more hamburgers, this can happen here. It was as simple as that. So I negated all the process of having to work in these confines of public space and insurance issues, etc. And what I'm really focusing on now, though, is I'm really interested in geographically repositioning the work that took place in Parkfield into an urban environment. You know, the concrete, the bitumen, the glass, the population, the people. I'm really interested in Los Angeles. I feel Los Angeles is a location that I'd really like to explore. It would require a vacant field, a defunct building site, a car park. It's very open to how this could be done. I'm interested in exploring the idea and I realise this could effectively be a disaster relief camp. I'm very interested in installing the machine somewhere downtown Los Angeles for about a month, run it off the same seismic activity, but bring in tents, bring in aid relief, and you could offer services, medical services, food, sleeping, and again, emphasise the fact that this is a dynamic landscape and in the outreach component to actually reach out and make people aware that this is a dynamic landscape, but also addressing the issues that we're dealing with now, and that is almost the marginalised communities. You know, I know Los Angeles, 20% of the population of Los Angeles is living in poverty. I think it would be really wonderful to, again, take this to the next step. So we've got the science, the art, but also the social issues. Which leads me to just these points here, which I'll read out. Future thinking towards greater public awareness and preparedness. Innovative communication and mediation strategies critically needed. Employ creative approaches in how we act now before the next big earthquake and lessen the impact before it occurs. Explore new cultural communication and contemporary cultural vehicles to get preparedness and awareness messages out. Adoption of social media tools is critical. Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, etc. Development of information delivery platforms for mobile devices, iPhones and Androids. Galvanise the public to engage in preparedness as a matter of lifestyle and informed choice. Make it hip, make it cool. The community is more likely to turn to a cultural organisation than to a governmental agency for support in an emergency. I think culture and the vehicles with culture could be a very effective tool to get this earthquake awareness, preparedness message out. And with that, I'd just like to thank you for your time and any questions.
Actually, before we start questions, there's actually one thought I had in terms of trying to explain what it was like to be there. Sort of a similar work that I think is very common in a lot of science museums are Foucault pendulums. What a Foucault pendulum does is it makes the rotation of the Earth, which is something that is going on right now, but we're basically unaware of, visible. But Foucault pendulums are essentially incredibly, while everyone watches them intently, they're sort of boring in a sense, because you know exactly when they're going to knock over the next little peg they usually have lined up, because the motion of the Earth is extraordinarily regular. This is sort of like watching a Foucault pendulum, but you have no idea when the next event is going. And you can show a video of the table shaking, but if you're actually there and going to wait for an earthquake, you have no idea if it's going to be a minute, an hour, 2 hours. And so it really, to be there and to experience it, sort of teaches you something about how earthquakes are happening. And it's those sort of things that are sort of hard to communicate, I think, really any other way, in a way that's as effective. So with that, I'll let if other people have questions. We have microphones. I'll bring one around. Stephanie has one in the back, too. So do you have any questions?
Yeah, I'm curious how this was all funded.
That's a good question. This work was unfunded. It actually received some sponsorship from Risk Management Solutions and Dejan Kolb Engineering, and some private philanthropy from Australia, and essentially my own funds. But this was unfunded work.
I was just wondering if you had any visual location of where the earthquakes were happening, perhaps in a CRT or something, you know.
No, but it's certainly something that I would love to explore, which would be wonderful in an exploratorium context. Two ways to do that. You could use quite simply Google itself to actually bring you to each location. It'd be wonderful to explore the possibility of real-time visualization of how this landscape is moving and how these waves propagate, which I think is something possibly that the US, the science here could be a connecting point to heading in that direction as both a visual display and an awareness component, but also, again, emphasise the dynamic nature of the landscape, how this machine was doing it, but in many ways a more simplistic form. And a work like that you could install in numerous places. You could have a streaming internet channel running like that continuously.
Yeah, I have two questions. Why do you put it in a trench? And the other question is, have you talked to any museums about setting it up for something where they would advertise it as a...
Certainly. First question, why was it installed in a trench? For this particular variation of it being shown, it was very important that the machine was immersed within the landscape. I felt to sit it on a field, it was not speaking about the connectivity of the landscape. I really wanted to actually have it below the surface of the land, so it was connected. If it was sitting on the surface, it would feel like an appendage, an attachment. I really wanted to embed it. It was critical. I was also playing with and working with the idea of intervention. It was very important that I was intervening with the landscape. Not only was the installation reflecting the seismic landscape, but physically it was intervening. Second question, museums. I haven't explored museums greatly at this point, though the Exploratorium in San Francisco would be a wonderful and possible site to install this kind of thing. But I also understand the financial constraints that, for example, the US economy is in right now, and how that could be explored and who would actually fund a work like that in a museum context. I also feel, though, I'm very interested in wanting to, why I talk about Los Angeles and literally why putting it on the street, I think it can have greater reach to a community that wouldn't normally experience this kind of thing and not be aware, and I feel it would have greater reaching and resonating effect quite literally outside.
Are there any other questions? Okay, actually, I'm just going to say one thing I think David sort of downplayed was the story of, the shake table was in a museum, the museum closed, they said, oh, you could have it. My understanding was it was on the second floor. So actually really what they said was, if you could get this 8,000-pound piece of equipment off the second floor of our building without it costing us anything, sure, keep it. So I think that shows the sort of perseverance that has gone on over 15 years or so to make these things happen. So thank you, David.
Thanks for your time.